Welcome, everyone. Happy, beautiful Friday, wherever you are in the world. My name is Kristen McKnight-Satie. I'm the Director of Education at Textile Center, and I am so very pleased to be introducing Aaron McIntosh for our conversation today. Aaron is a fourth-generation quilter. He is originally from Tennessee, but lives in Montreal and has exhibited widely. He's quite accomplished in his creative practice. And I know we're all looking forward to learning more about that creative practice and also the opportunity to work with Aaron next month, because Aaron will be in Minneapolis at Textile Center, leading two different workshops: the Sculptural Approaches to Quilting workshop, which is June 16th through 18th at Textile Center, and then also a separate workshop, a second workshop, the Queer Quilting Bee workshop, which is June 20th and 21st. So we're very excited for that and for learning more about Aaron's practice. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the proverbial mic over to you, Aaron. And yeah, looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Kristen and Chloe and the other staff members of the Textile Center. And thank you, Kristen, for the invitation to teach at the Textile Center. I've known about it for many years. I even feel like I maybe remember learning about when it started, but I might be wrong on that too. So welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to chat with the Minnesota and further afield communities interested in fibers and textiles. I'm Aaron McIntosh. I'm a fourth generation quilt maker, as Kristen just spoke about. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains of East Tennessee and learned a lot of the quilting traditions that I know from my mother's side, who were more traditional pattern-based quilt makers, actually from Southwest Virginia. And on my dad's side, in the same area that I'm from in East Tennessee, were more improvisational quilters. Um, Come from two families of sharecroppers and people who found beauty in the world which they surrounded themselves with. So in the mountains, in farming and agricultural communities, in making their homes, making the material culture that they would surround themselves with. And so it's from those traditions of making and making do that I come from. I'm also a textile professor, have been for 17 years. I teach in fibers and textile university programs from the Maryland Institute College of Art to Virginia Commonwealth University and now Concordia University here in Montreal. I love teaching textiles and especially teaching piecework, patchwork, scrap-based, and quilt traditions to my students wherever I've taught, including workshops like the one at the Textile Center, because as a queer person who is for both environmental reasons and also just for queer reasons, I'm not choosing to have children. So I really like taking the family traditions that I've learned and passing them on to the students that I work with. So that's also a big part of my practice. Um, and I guess I'll kind of dig into the work. You're all probably tired of looking at yourselves here. So um, let me get the view on this. Okay. Um, so as I was saying, I have a tradition of making kind of like classic or traditional American style quilts. These are some of them. My work has long been interested in a fusion of queer identity, queer community building, erotics, desire, mediated desires, and looking at the quilt as a platform from which to work these ideas into a multi-generational tradition from which I come. So these are some older works, much older works. Twin beds, they use classic patterns that any quilt makers on the Zoom call would recognize: double wedding ring, and then just a sort of a generic 8-point star. Um, I'm really invested in this idea of piecework, patchwork, and scrap-based practices. coming from a family where people were always saving things, that comes from a post-depression era mentality. Some might call that hoarding, but also some would call it resourcefulness or making do, as my family would call it. Um, so I'm really interested in, again, and I call that a piecework as paradigm, a global paradigm. Every culture on the planet has some kind of textile tradition, and given on based on the difficulty in making many traditional textiles, every little scrap was also a very cherished or important thing to keep, to hold on to, and work into a new form. Um, so the origins of quilt making are related in that kind of scrap-based mentality. And I'm interested in expanding, extending, extrapolating that scrap-based thinking towards how we also think about identity. This isn't, I don't see it specific to queer identity. I see it specific to my queer identity, my origin stories, where I come from, and how I have become the person that I am within my identity. But I think that everyone themselves is is a complex quilt, a patchwork, of all the different connections that we've touched throughout our lives. Um, you know, again, quilters, textile enthusiast would know that, a lot of us keep fabric because of the memory that we've enshrined on it, or that others have themselves. So sort of interwoven throughout my talk, I'll kind of point to some of the things that are themselves scrap-based ways of me embedding my family history into different projects, or my queer kinship networks into different projects. The focus of this talk is related to the workshop that I'm offering at the Textile Center, and that is sculptural approaches to quilt making. There are a million quilt workshops out there in the world. So when I'm invited to do these kinds of workshops at craft schools or textile centers, I tend to try to think about, well, like what is maybe missing in the educational or curriculum of a lot of those places. And as a textile artist who works primarily like through the quilt as a medium, but also through a lot of sculptural approaches, I feel like that's something I can offer in those spaces. It's a little different. And so these first images are just some of the more sculptural things that I've been working on over the past 15 plus years. Um, they are themselves copies of objects from my family homes, and things that themselves kind of narrate some of the material culture from which I come. So this is a replica of a taxidermied black bear, my mom's side in Virginia. They are all bear hunters, women included. So I don't participate in those traditions, but I grew up around them to a point that I've been long interested in, like what a family values, what they don't value, how I can intersect in some of those spaces, and kind of muddy the waters in, from my perspective, a complex and helpful way of thinking about intergenerational moves in the studio, craft traditions, but also intervening in cultural traditions too. Um, this is a segue to talk about the first project I want to talk about, which is called Invasive Queer Kudzu. But that project began with me looking again at the world that surrounds me. And these are some of the first works that we're taking on a sort of a botanical theme in the practice. And that is what my focus has like been very squarely practice on, or practice has been based on for the past 10 years. Um, in the months leading up to my grandmother passing, outside of Roanoke, Virginia, my family was in her final garden. She's a big gardener, was a breeder of irises, and I have a lot of fun memories, and my green thumb comes from that side of the family. But we were out in her final garden picking weeds, and because of her ill health, it had been left rather untended for several months. And out in the garden, recognizing in this complex time where I came back to be with the family for her final weeks, and the ways in which my queerness was not welcome, I found a real kind of kinship with the weeds that we were picking, which themselves are plants that grow of their own volition, happily doing their own thing. Many are native species, some of them aren't, but the kind of the vitriol that a lot of uh, well, not just rural-based people, but many people who garden have towards weeds and what they are. And but weeds are plants that are thriving on their own accord, often in the absence of human intervention. And I find that a very fertile way to think about queerness in the very Christian, dominative, very heteronormative background that I'm from. So finding ways to thrive, peek through the crevices where they find them. So these are weeds that are growing out of a range of sources that respond to my background, my upbringing, come from like a family of women who were quilters and romance novels readers. So these things are coming out of these multiple eras of desire, early imprintings of like what would make me understand both my sexuality and my identity. So from gay pornography to romance novels to crocheted Afghan blankets and quilt fragments. And thinking about weeds got me thinking about kind of the ultimate southern weed, which you don't really have in the state of Minnesota, but is kudzu. Maybe you've heard about it. It's often used as a metaphor for decay and unruliness in the U.S. South. This is what kudzu looks like. It has a kind of a beautiful way of blanketing over landscapes. It's the kind of terminology that's often used for it. And I also always kind of viewed it with wonder as a child growing up around it, but I was also surrounded by so much, like, again, hatred, xenophobia. People I grew up with people saying it's the vine that came from Asia and invaded. So kudzu has a really long and complex history in how it was introduced to the US South. In short, it was planted, 70 million seedlings were planted during the Eisenhower era along the new infrastructure built for the US interstate system as erosion control and also along railroad beds. So seeing kudzu from the window of a car is where most people experience it. It has kind of a boogeyman mentality, not only in the Southern imagination, but also in U.S. Agricultural policy. It became the poster child of the U.S. Invasive Species Act. And the first ecological study was ever undertaken in 2014 on the eve of me launching this project, determined that actually it's never really fundamentally destroyed any ecosystems. So it has become a very different metaphor for me to work through over the past 10 years. But the first kudzu that I was making is really similar to those other weeds that you were just looking at, except and those weeds were also kind of made of this amalgamation of materials that defined me, including queer literary sources. And the first kudzu I was making really leaned into that. So some of my earliest adventures in queer archives were in gay erotica, but also in kind of just the literary archives. I've always been a big reader, as a kid, always had my nose in a book. Um, and a lot of, again, my own queer identity has been shaped and in many ways formed around the literary references that I've grown up reading over the past 25 years. This work is a lot of those references. There's a lot of Truman Capote in this, Edmund White, James Baldwin, along with Walt Whitman's poetry from Leaves of Grass. And that is also countered by ads for um, like phone sex, for dating apps. Well, this is pre-app generation and personal ads. So sort of thinking about queer longing across the literary divide, but also a queer cultural divide. And was making this for myself. This is a project I did in collaboration with a photographer, good friend Nick Clifford Simcoe, in which we sort of made three versions of me kind of being overtaken by this quilted queer kudzu. Um, was happy making this on my own. And so the first exhibition that I had shown of this was again kind of like this small tree covered in it. And feedback that I got from other artist peers in my time at Baltimore was that, well, if you're going to take on kudzu, you really have to get to this space. Like, what is it going to mean to like actually occupy space in the way that kudzu does? And so that kind of launched me on a totally different path to thinking about what would become eventually this larger 10 years in the making project called Invasive Queer Kudzu. And the initial, even seen in the kind of symbol here that I made for the project, um, idea for this was to really investigate queer Southern archives. As a person raised in the South, but coming out in my mid-20s, didn't know about a lot of the queer legacies in my own homelands and those in the nearby, and had to go actually pretty far and wide to learn about a lot of queer Southern history, especially at the grassroots level. This took me to Los Angeles, which is the largest LGBTQ uh, archives in the world at the One Archives, and discovered a lot of really incredible sources there, like this lesbian separatist publication out of the Chapel Hill Triangle region in North Carolina called Feminary. A lot of luminaries in that. It was really amazing to be familiarized with a number of queer archives from the South and to read about the kind of liberation struggles people were encountering in the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s that we're still facing and grappling with today. This would take me pretty far and wide, but another archive I spent a lot of time with is the Bots Archive in Houston, which was in the basement of a church. And the sort of keeper of the flame is this wonderful man, Larry Crisco, who passed away 2 years ago. And the Bots Archive itself is now part of Rice University. But it was these really beautiful moments of sort of being with the people who had chosen to preserve these archives. I mean, this particular archive was almost twice lost due to flooding. And anyways, this is the unpaid volunteer labor of these keepers of the flame, as they're often called, who decide to uphold queer histories where there is no state apparatus that would otherwise preserve our histories. Um, and I sort of frame all this because a lot of my work throughout the years has been invested in queer archives as both a special site for learning about queer legacy, understanding an ongoing liberation struggle, um, situating queers within their own cultural contexts and histories, within a North American context, but also in a global context to all the places where queer liberation, including the United States presently, is under threat. And it is also a complex space um, whose story, any archive is kind of in the way that history is told and read, in the very word that we use, including like a masculine way of framing history, is complex. The stories are told by the captors or the winners. And that means that even in queer archives, we encounter complicated spaces, stories that are omitted, different communities that are not included in these archives. And so even in a queer archive, one encounters that. And I had decided to make this a really large project with many queer kudzu leaves, like you see there, based on queer archives, and that would be this massive amount of kudzu that I would grow. But quickly realized that the kind of stories that are in queer archives are themselves rather limited, and don't include a lot of Black communities, don't include a lot of communities of color who were very much a part of those liberation struggles throughout this and since the advent of gay liberation in 1969. So that forced the project to expand and move into what I had been focused on stories from the past, also include stories from the present, to make sure that this wasn't just a backwards looking project. Um, the AIDS quilt was a very formative aspect of thinking about this project. What does it mean to have stories that would be about celebration and also be about memorializing trauma and traumatic events, like the number of deaths from AIDS? And so this is one particular way that the quilt is brought into like a national or international space of mourning, and also a space of forging collective memory around queer and LGBTQ lives. So my project has this as a kind of a foremother or fore ancestor, and would pivot into sort of a different space. I'm working with this botanic metaphor, the kudzu leaf itself. It's a rather small platform to share a story, but it was sort of the idea of in mass. These will be this formidable presence to talk about the way that kudzu, like other weeds, but especially kudzu, is a real thriver in a rather inhospitable environment. So to be queer and to survive, not only in past times, but in present times in the South, is an act of thrivance, is a way of combating dominant forces that would really wish that we didn't exist and would really wish that our stories didn't exist. So this Queer Kudzu project is itself includes stories from the past, stories from the present. It's very grounded in community activism, but also in just community spirit, community joy. These are participants from Houston. So a lot of times the project involved visits to archival sites, collecting images, documents, scans, and photographs of those, and then also doing community-oriented events live, where people would write stories about how they thrive in the queer South. Some of them are simply just documenting themselves, like adding their name, their identity, where they're from as a contribution, as a kind of story, that kind of testament to queer thrivance. And then many of them mark specific events in queer history in the South, or in this case, communities. So, like the crew of Armenius is the oldest queer Mardi Gras crew from New Orleans. And anyways, I need to keep going. I've got a lot to share, so I'll just kind of move a little more quickly through these. But these are different community events. I loved the project, always had a really intergenerational bent, working between archives and present community events. So it was really beautiful moments of meeting queer elders at different centers, and younger generational folks, taking the project to rural spaces as long as along with urban spaces. I myself am a rural queer. Don't live a rural queer existence now, but am from that space and know that also there, sort of flyover country is also full of a lot of rich queer communities and traditions. um, Partnered with a lot of different organizations, and um, I guess just as a note to the ways in which the under the last Obama administration, the inclusion of LGBTQ sites of memoriam as a part of the National Park Service, which is currently being dismantled by the current U.S. government. This was a moment where actually this was a beautiful open source platform of people could write in an open source Google form what they would also suggest from their communities as a site to memorialize. And so the project was very active in sort of sharing that information with people and sharing booth space at Pride events across the South to get the word out about a project like that. Um, have done a lot of community quilting bees with queer youth organizations over the years when the project was based in Richmond, Virginia. Um, and so it was this amassment of all of these projects. This is one of the queer community events. So again, the leaves are pretty small. They represent a nice opportunity for people to very quickly write a message about their lives, their histories, and for allies to write messages of support. It's a pretty small platform to quilt too, so it was also a nice opportunity to teach people the really basics of what quilting is. And towards this purpose of what I'll be offering at the Textile Center, it's also a really nice and simple intervention to think about quilting in a sculptural dimension. So each of these quilted leaves is wired. It has a channel in the center, and it can be really shaped to look a little more like a live leaf. And I have some things right behind me as like recent examples in the studio of how I think through that quilting logic and the possibilities of the quilt as a multi-layered textile. The project would, from the beginning, had this feat of deciding what would we do with all of these collected queer kudzu stories. And so the idea was to take over problematic monuments in the South, not just to cover uh, random trees or light posts or something like that. So these are just some examples. These are sort of working draft drawings of what the kudzu could cover. So problematic state houses that have passed, Alabama continues to this day to be the most homophobic state, has the most homophobic legislation in the United States, to like where I was living at the time and have a long history with Richmond, Virginia, and its legacy of racist monuments, all of which have now been taken down post 2020. So the project has been interested also in sites of queer erasure, former gay neighborhoods, like the one I lived in Baltimore, Mount Vernon, no longer exist as a queer neighborhood due to gentrification. So this first kudzu project was in Baltimore, at an art space called School 33, and this was a memoriam to one of the oldest continuously operating gay nightclubs in U.S. history, called the Club Hippo. And so this is a two-scale replication of the corner facade of the building. And so it's situated with the street signs that you see there. And in the back is a brick wall of wheat pasted posters from throughout the Club Hippo's history. This is just a little GIF of the process of making these large-scale installations. So there's sort of an understory of archive story leaves, and then there is the vines, the ones that are made in community, are actually these vines, many of them as long as 75 to 125 feet long. So that's how that comes together. There's another detail of that and the posters in the background. It was a really beautiful event. We had a disco party when we opened the show and closed it, and a lot of people sort of saw the focus of each exhibition are the archives and community stories that have been made in that community. So a lot of Baltimoreans came out and sort of saw and found themselves in the leaves, which is a really beautiful moment there. These are some details of, again, community ones. They're made with Baltimoreans, and then also from Baltimore's own archives. The second and last big installation of the project happened in Richmond, Virginia, where I had moved to and involved covering over a fallen monument. So we sort of recreated to scale a 43-foot monument, one of the most problematic ones, the Jefferson Davis Monument, um, sort of destroyed it and left it in situ, imagining the space with which it normally exists, which is Monument Avenue in Richmond, which is a long boulevard as a park in the center, that the destroyed statue would be left in place to kind of honor its destruction, sort of honor the destruction of a white supremacist monument, and then letting these queer kudzu stories sort of take over that. So replacing one problematic history with a rethinking about, again, this problematic invasive species, but the potential for it. The project was really invested in rethinking a monumentality altogether. What do monuments mean? And really thinking about the logic of a fallen tree in the forest, which provides a whole new generation of nutriment to a next generation of forest creatures, plant life, people, and sort of as we think about it in a larger ecological sense, the planet. So how can the destruction of a racist monument also, and leaving it there, showing the destruction on display, thinking about it in a generative sense. So these are some of that is the monument being taken over as it stands, some of the inspiration of thinking about fallen sites and ruins as a productive space of public discourse. These are other images of that, the queer stories taking over the fallen monument, and just some other images of that. Again, as you'll see, the kind of sculptural potential of like wiring each leaf, like sort of making it, was always a very intentional thing that the vine itself would not look dead or dying. And as those of you at a textile center would know, textiles themselves need an armature or support of another kind unless they are structurally built like a basket to support themselves. So it's important for me to really think about some of those practical moves in the studio along the evolution of this project. The project involved a series of what we kind of called queer quilting bees, but they were expanded beyond just the rubric of a quilt per se, or the rubric of a quilting bee of just making one community quilt. So we had these weekend workshops. They featured things like inviting multi-generational kudzu basket weavers into the space, and people learned how to actually like make productive things from baskets or from kudzu. Again, sort of like turning against this the negative vitriol of the kudzu vine and thinking about it in this productive space. And we served biscuits with kudzu jelly every weekend. We had DJs and weekday dance parties, things like that. Along with just a very regular every other week, we were quilting the vines that were being contributed live on these picnic tables. I'm really happy to say that this project was in 2019, and then in 2020, after George Floyd and the political groundswell around the removal of these racist monuments. You in Minneapolis would be very familiar with a lot of this movement. This monument came down. So it is an interesting and reflective space to think about. Um, I mean, one reason I took on this project was to propose something that would probably never happen. In the state of Virginia, they had something called the War Memorials Act that had been passed by prior Republican legislatures that pretty much guaranteed that no Confederate monuments would ever come down because they were all deemed war memorials. So part of me recreating that monument was to actually sort of put in place something that many of us would hope for towards combating white supremacy embedded in that state. So I'm going to fast forward to a project I've been working on since then. I took a job opportunity, relocated to Montreal, sort of taking myself out of the Southern context. And then a pandemic happens. I moved to Montreal in January 2020. And then, as we all know, in April 2020, a global pandemic would shut down things like these community workshops that I had long been planning. There were several years of planning. To happen in 2020 and 2021 to continue the kudzu project that all had to be shut down because of no more community gatherings. So that shifted my thinking around that project in a lot of different ways, and also myself, my removal, my new life in Canada sort of got me to thinking about the botanic underpinnings of that whole project. And working with kudzu, researching kudzu, its history, invasive species, weeds, all of these things, I had been learning more and more about botany's interesting histories over the years. And it kind of shifted my mind to thinking about a sort of a larger ways in which queer people, queer communities, queer identities have a lot of other rich metaphors in the history of botany and plants that themselves have these very across the globe, cross-cultural histories, and the ways in which some plants have thrived on different continents than which they were ever designed. I find a sort of a ripe metaphor too for how queerness has thrived in these different environs and has also been influenced by a multitude of cultural influences. So that led me to think about this hothouse project, which is ongoing. It will have its first exhibition this coming September here in Montreal. The sort of research notes that came out of it have influenced the projects I've been working on for the past 5 years. So the project started with a rethinking of what nourishes queer communities. All of the archives that I talked about being invested in recently, or sorry, dating back to the Kudzu project and actually dating back to older works. Um, I wanted to sort of rethink also nutriment and compost, like the archive is a kind of compost heap, something between the living, current people being interested in archives, and then the dead and dying, like our former art queer ancestors that are in those spaces too. And archives themselves as this kind of many queer archives are not organized in the way that like official Library of Congress archives would be kept, organized, and held. There is a lot of debate within queer archives about how much they should be digitized and available to the public because of the ways in which our communities have so traditionally been surveilled through things like state apparatus of archives. And so that's a very active conversation right now. So I wanted to take sort of all of these things back to a natural uh, conversation, sort of an ecological conversation of thinking through queer archives and a metaphor of compost. So I launched this project called Q Matter. It was an invitation for queer people across North America or Turtle Island to send in an element of something of organic matter. So clothing, underwear, letters, books. People sent in the prescription packaging for their hormone treatments. Send this all, and we sort of started macerating it, making it into paper pulp, and then doing different things with it. That, but so to kind of think about breaking down and then bringing together, amalgamating, composting, queer stories. And so there was a first batch of things that were received, and then that batch of things were uh, pulped, made into sheets of paper, printed with compost activator. That's the vermicular pattern you see on this the image on the right, and then sent back out to a next generation who were then invited to send things back. And so this compost heap, which is kind of a like dry leaf matter reference to compost, is going to be part of this exhibition, but it's also it's a part of compost piles across North America, which is also interested in that kind of vector mentality, taking sort of the idea of the vector away from disease, and containment, and sort of using it like kudzu to think about thrivance and queer vectors across Turtle Island. Um, that was part one of the project. Part two has been the ongoing one. It's called Exuberant Botanica, and that name is a specific reference to a core text released in 1999, but was the backbone of many years in the making of research work of a text called Biological Exuberance by someone named Bruce Badgemill. This is the He is looking back at the past 2,000 years of scientific observation and study and looking in everything from marginalia to unpublished notes dating back to Aristotle to present day science when science observers or scientists, biologists, botanists, etc., were observing homosexual, homosocial, and queer activity in the animalian world and not publishing those findings due to everything we're seeing happening with the US government right now, lack of funding, researchers' titles and research funding being stripped away because they would include something inappropriate about queerness. But queerness is in the animal world as it is in the human world, and we've known that uh, since the times of Aristotle. And so, anyways, this project is looking specifically at the ways that the plant world can be seen in an expansive way for us, not only as queer people, but just as human critters, to think differently about identity formation, sexuality, and the way in which the plant world offers like a multitude of ways to think about um, reproduction, reproductive capacity that is not rooted in a heteronormative space or a monogamous space. So the very different ways that plants get it on and reproduce that is again not about just a female and a male copulating. Something I was very interested in and thinking actually all the way down to kind of the ways in which that children are often taught about human sexuality through the lens of mammalian sexuality through exhibits at museums where, for instance, there is a male specimen, a female specimen, and then their offspring as a way to kind of enshrine or make permanent that this is the only way that reproduction happens, or this is the only way that sexuality and identity actually is formed. So the project has taken a lot of twists and turns, but in essence has been building towards the idea of a queer herbal. So the origins of medicine, all medicine, not just queer medicine, are rooted in herbal histories. And so this center thing here is John Gerard's The Great Herbal or the History of Plants is considered from 1663 is considered the compilation of the prior 1,000 years knowledge of herbal medicine and healing practices. So this is kind of pre-scientific method, um, very early Enlightenment, but these early herbals were themselves a very globally informed, with medicine coming from the Eastern world, from the European world, and coming together in these herbal books that were, in a lot of ways, the only healing mechanism we had before the invention of modern science and before the understanding of disease at the molecular level or the cellular level. So. Um, this with the Q matter and with this, these were male projects. That's sort of again the pandemic forming of them, and they were sent out to people as an invitation to participate and to contribute. So people were invited to contribute the idea for a queer herb that could heal something related to an ailment within their queer identity, their sexuality, their gender expression, gender identity, or within the queer community. So this is on the far right is one of those contributions. This took me on like a really long journey of learning a whole lot about botanic history, even more than I had with the kudzu project, and the various connections between queerness and witchcraft, but the various ways in which um, queer people probably in an ancient past, unrecorded in history, were using different herbal remedies to survive. And that has informed a lot of different research up to this point, but includes like a long list of what I am saying is a queer herbal. So this includes actual plants, and will be including these speculative plants that people have been contributing. this work, this research is manifested in a lot of different ways, including these large-scale sculptural quilts, which are titled entanglements. They feature queer archives, a la other projects you've seen of mine from the beginning of this presentation. But these are upright, freestanding quilts. They're made to sort of like posit the archive in a very large, kind of touchable, feelable way. Um, and the archives are being entangled, in this case, by representations of morning glory vine. There you see the queer compost in action. The quilts are planted in these queer compost containers. And this is the second one. These were shown at Northeastern University 2 years ago as a part of an exhibition that combined the Queer Kudzu Project and the newer research. Um, and some detail images of that, a detail image of the queer compost there. And then this leads me to the most recent body of work, which I'll talk super briefly about because we're running towards time. But at the invitation to think of a new body of work for a gallery here in Montreal, Pierre-François Ouellet Art Contemporain, I wanted to show the two freestanding quilts, the Entanglement series, alongside something that had been building for me since the pandemic, which is the further erosion of queer and trans rights, especially those in the United States and in North America, with the advent of these bathroom bills. Um, and sort of the growing hostility that which is now on just very flagrant display under the Trump administration, of the ways in which our identities are being erased, the ways in which our sexual practices are being monitored, and the just multitude of ways. I mean, as a queer person, we have seen this before. To work in queer archives, you see evidence of the ways in which queer people and communities have been forced into the shadows. And so I wanted to address this in a body of work that was bringing in the queer herbs that I've been looking at and their histories, and kind of veiling queer archives in that. So the quilts are surrounded by these quilts that are almost so dark that you don't really see what is going on. They almost sort of resonate as shadowy rectangles or quilts on the wall. They sort of come off the wall a bit too. Um, and the quilts themselves are sort of a reference to, and the title of the exhibition is the gloaming, which itself is an old Scottish word, but a way of thinking about the falling dusk, in which figures and landscape become uh, difficult to discern. What is a figure? What is a plant? What is a tree? It's sort of this very green space, that falling darkness. And so these are images of the works. Again, they're very dark, they're very layered. They involve a new thing for me in the studio, which is working with organza as a transparent dark layer, in which, to be close with the works, they don't resonate, especially in photographic images, but you sort of see through them and you sort of see these multitude of layers. So there are quilted layers, they are themselves, and the title of each work is a reference to these specific queer herbs that I am referencing that have these long-standing queer histories. Some of them I'm indexing as a protective kind of charm. They do not, like physically in the body, do not do anything, but they would have been taken as, for instance, a charm against nightmares, or to protect against foul forces. So I'll go rather quickly through these. These are available on the gallery's website if you'd like to spend more time and look at different details. But again, they each start with an image from a queer archival source of a vulnerable man. And then there is a buildup of at least 4 to 5 layers of this interaction of these sort of shadowy herbs that are a kind of protective shadow of these queer figures. And they themselves are also a reference to cruising in the woods after dark, seeing the forest, seeing the garden, seeing this time of the gloaming as perhaps one of the most protective spaces queer people might find themselves in and thrive in these darker times. Again, just sort of a sweep of the work, and the close-ups there of those. And so I will kind of round us out with just where the work has kind of taken me, and where it's sort of continuing manifesting, especially as it relates to the workshop I'll be offering, is like the continued exploration of sculptural forms. They're again historic reference, so in this case, looking at and referencing the very peculiar histories around the mandrake, but thinking about like its possibility for these speculative plants, in this case, like what could happen if in a speculative sense, like sex toys could be grown instead of made out of plastic and things that aren't body safe. Um, Looking at again these different histories of different herbs and their queer connective histories. Um, Things like the morning glory, which was used as a hallucinogen in past times, especially to protect against foul forces. Um, this is actually this is an image of the work that's right behind me too, but there's a work titled Grafted, which is thinking again about sort of back to what I started with the presentation of um, piecework as a kind of paradigm, patchwork as a way of thinking about identity formation, grafting practices, right? The practice of bringing, it's common to orchard fruits, but bringing one kind of orchard fruit and grafting a branch onto a different kind of tree. But grafting exists in the botanic world in many different forms. But thinking as myself, a kind of like a quilt, like a patchwork quilt, a kind of grafted form, queerness and queer communities as being grafted from many different ideas, cultures, queer norms, queer kinships across time and space. So I'll end there. It's an image with my website, different ways you can find me on social media. And again, thank you for listening to this talk, and I hope that people are excited about the workshop to come. Thank you.
Erin, thank you so much. I'm actually just going to pop into the chat links for the workshops because you've mentioned them a couple of times. So that is the Sculptural Approaches to Quilting workshop, and that's the June 16th through 18th. And then also we have that second workshop, which is the Queer Community Quilting Bee workshop. And that also has for anyone who's interested, there's a kind of sliding scale pay what you can tuition structure for that one. So I encourage anyone who's interested to please join, sign up. We have probably about 10 minutes per questions. I personally am like bursting with so many thoughts based on what you shared with us. It's really, as someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about archives and thinking about what is missing from archives, and then how we sort of read between the lines, I was struck when you talked about, which very familiar kind of language, that, archives are telling stories by the winners, by the ones who are the victors in a particular kind of history. But what I always find, and there's a kind of poetry to what you're doing, is that textiles or fiber arts are very often the kinds of archival objects that we have that actually tell stories from a kind of subaltern or minority perspective. And so that's always been something that has fueled my own interest in fiber arts, and something that I see kind of happening with your material choices. So I will invite anyone to ask any questions, Sarah, and you can add them to the chat if you'd like, and I'm happy to then amplify them or just read them out. And I have more comments, not explicit questions, but I was glad to see that you brought up the AIDS quilt. That is something that, the Textile Center Book Club last fall, we read Julia Bryan Wilson's Friend.
Hmm.
And, I remember when she was talking about the AIDS quilt, she talks about it as a kind of unstable, kind of marginal object, and uses that and uses the quilt itself as a kind of metaphor for queerness, and talking about even within textiles, certainly within fine art spaces, but even within textiles, that quilts have oftentimes been marginalized or thought as sort of kitschy or debased. And it was just wonderful for me to sort of think about how you're taking taking that form of the quilt and really kind of exploding it, and bringing it into new kind of visual form.
Thanks. I'm a huge fan of that particular writing, and in like a longer academic talk, I usually include a few references from Julia. But yeah, I'm really interested in her notion of to textile, like to use it in a verb sense, politics. And yeah, very indebted to her for
Absolutely.
some of those thoughts.
We've got Randy has sent a message. Um, Erin, thank you. As an artist with very good work, how do you think about or navigate the established cultures or silos within which your work may exist? So craft, textile, contemporary art,
Mhm.
academic research worlds. Great question. Also something Julia talks about too. But yeah, Erin, do you
Yeah.
want let me make sure I'm going to copy that into the chat too so that it's visible to everybody. Uh,
I mean, I don't know that I have any, how do I navigate it? I guess I just keep navigating is the honest answer. Um, I am lucky, really privileged to have a job. Like a part of my job is doing art research, along with teaching. So, um, I'm I think what the hardest thing is just balancing the making. My work takes a lot of time to make, with the actual research that needs to go into it. Um, so a strategy, I don't know if you're asking about strategies, but is that I have tried to do more academic research minded residencies instead of art residencies so that I have a more specific time set aside to just, for instance, like learn about those herbal histories. I was at a really great residency several years ago called Oak Spring Garden. That is the foundation of all of the research for the Exuberant Botanica project, and it was actually being able to see and spend time like physically touch this wide range of herbals, from medieval manuscript herbals to the kinds of like hippie era new herbal medicine that was kind of being reintroduced in some of those original texts. Um, and and then having these like focused studio time to actually sort of bring the work, like turn the research into the work. Um, I think working, these have both projects are like the Queer Kudzu project, and the Hot House Maison Chaude, which I should say the sort of the title of the project is sort of a reference and a rethinking of like what are the possibilities of a greenhouse, like towards like nourishing special rare species, thinking about queerness as like a special rare species too. That sort of the compost and the exuberant botanica, like everything is coming together in this hothouse. And so that's the show that I'm working on currently. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, in terms of like category, that was, I guess, an element of your question too, like silos. Um, I mean, I think I've been the kind of artist for like, or crafter for a long time. Like I'm just so disinterested in those labels. And when I came out as a queer person, not a gay person. I'm like easily clockable as a gay guy, and it's fine. I don't care. But I kind of own my identity as a queer person because I am disinterested in like these like really narrow-minded ways that whatever another system would want to kind of pin my sexuality or pinpoint it as something specific, or my identity or community alliances as something specific. And so think it's kind of the same for me too. I mean, I have a background in like something that's even different than the quote unquote craft world, because I'm from a multi-generational family of makers. And so my family didn't use words like craft or we're part of the craft community. They were just making as they made. And I grew up within like a lot of rich storytelling traditions and know a lot of the stories and own the quilts of, for instance, like my great grandfathers who were also quilt makers. And I didn't grow up with a gender paradigm around quilting as a craft because a lot of men also participated in it. So yeah, I don't know. I'm in general kind of, I find very hidebound and like hard edge identities kind of icky.
you're not
So,
alone, I think, in that.
so I don't, I'm okay with the word artist because it can contain a lot of multitudes and it doesn't, I mean, even like my musician friends call themselves artists. So, I think most craft artists call themselves, a part of that word is artist. So, um, and at the same time, I'm very indebted to craft tradition and very interested in craft traditions. Um, so Yeah, and sometimes too, like get pegged as like, well, you're a fiber artist, and I'm like, well, yeah, sure, I am. That's fine too. Like I teach fiber. I'm like probably a fiber and textile prof. Um, I think the best way I can explain like why I gravitate towards what I gravitate is it in essence it is related to these traditions from which I come, but it's also and it's very much informed by those traditions, but it's just the thing that I gravitate towards the most quickly. I think some artists like the medium that they find their like joie de vivre in or their like esprit de corps is in metal or it's in paint or it's in watercolor or it's in holding a pencil and drawing. And um, I generally, when I think of an idea, I think about it first in fabric and in cloth. And furthermore, I think about like the scraps of cloth. I mean, like right over here is in this big cabinet, like a color organized system of keeping my cloth. But I actually have like up in here, like a really good memory of like where each piece of that cloth came from. And I didn't go into it, but I mean, even what's on the screen right now, like every work I ever make includes a bit of what I call family cloth, which is just things that I inherited from so many generations of quilters. And I'm the only like my generation in my family who does this in a serious way or kind of a continuous way. So it's important that those like family connections are in there, even though and because of the complicated relationship I have to my family and those traditions. Um, so yeah, I don't
Erin,
know.
can I pop in with one more question?
Yeah, go for
This
it.
is actually a student who'll be taking your workshop
Great.
is curious to know how you engage with or kind of challenge workshop students during these concentrated work times and
Mhm.
let's see, to approach their own individual concerns. So I guess maybe a little bit of a question about how you structure how you're sort of thinking about structuring this
Mhm.
workshop at Textile Center or past workshops, because I know that there's always a little bit of push and pull, right, with this sort of individual making and then also sort of community
Yeah.
making.
Well, because it's a such a concentrated one, we're mostly going to work through like a little suite of techniques that I just find really helpful. And like I'll kind of determine on the first day if everyone wants to like make a finished thing or if people are more excited about leaving with just like a little suite of samples. But we'll mostly work through some core sculptural ideas using channels in between quilts, and then kind of making these. We're going to start with these like a reverse patterning project. So I'm going to ask everyone to bring an object, something small, relatively simple, and we will make a skin out of tape. And then we'll take that apart and then we will sort of make that as a kind of quilt. So like a sort of a replica of a small object, thinking through like quilt and multi-layer density and stuff like that. But we're going to be talking about the ways that as compartite textiles, but multi-layered textiles, quilts have a certain kind of structure to themselves. And so I've chosen to focus it more just towards like technical than project, but if people feel like a really strong desire to like leave with a certain kind of small object. I mean, it's not a full week long, so I don't know that we would like get very advanced towards projects, but I'll show images of what students have done in longer 1 week workshops and 2 week workshops. Um, but that's the general goal. It's going to be a pretty like technique-y workshop. That's what I've designed.
Great.
Um, yeah.
Sounds great. I think technique workshops are always great fun.
Yeah, I think I didn't answer a first part of that question, which was like, which I think is maybe a hidden way of asking, like, if I'm not queer, what do you have to teach me? So, I think that's why I grounded the talk at the very beginning, which with this idea of like, I see piecework, and first day of the workshop, we'll be talking about that. Like, I'll ask everyone to bring some scraps, and like kind of talk through their identity, whatever identity that is, like through fabric. It's one of my favorite questions to ask students on a first day of any class is like, if you were a cloth, what would you be and why? So we'll talk about our scraps, like what they mean, what they can mean, like how one might use them in just any quilt context. um, or in specific, like a sculptural context. Um, and Yeah, I think I have a lot to offer, if even if you're not queer. I mean, I also think that queerness is a way of understanding the world and thinking differently about our identities, regardless of which way we come from. So I hope that answers that. But yeah,
I think it is. It's perfectly done. Well, we're at time. I want to be respectful of your time, Erin, and to thank you so much for sharing your work with us. We are really excited to have you here with us next month, and it's really a treasure to get this little bit of a preview of your brilliant ideas and having you share your thoughts with us. So I'm so grateful. Thank you to all who joined. Yeah, please reach out if you have any questions about the workshops. Thank you for have a beautiful weekend. I hope everyone enjoys their lovely weekend ahead.
thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It was really lovely to spend some virtual time with you all and those who I'll meet, I guess, in person, IRL, in a month. I'll see you then.